After Queen Elizabeth's death, her advisors dared to carefully search her personal belongings. During this search, they discovered a very important and unexpected treasure, a letter hidden deep within her possessions. When the spouses seriously examined the find, their blood seemed to run cold, as the contents of the letter proved to be astonishing and extremely distressing. The story of Queen Elizabeth's pregnancy and rise can be described as a tapestry of the most vivid and dramatic events of the era. In 1333, the future queen was born during a time filled with the greatest scandal of the period. It was an era when her mother and favorite, named Boleyn, overcame all obstacles to enter King Henry VII's bedchamber, which led to his extensive divorce from Queen Catherine of Aragon. This divorce not only caused personal drama, but also sparked a large-scale religious reform in England that changed the course of the country's history. However, this was only the beginning of a series of tumultuous events that shook the English dynasty. Not everyone can claim that their own father ordered their mother's execution, but that was exactly what happened in Elizabeth's fate. As a result of intrigue and power struggles, Boleyn lost the king's trust, and on May 19, 1536, he sentenced her to execution, little more than 2 years old at the time. Soon after this tragic event, she gained a new maternal figure. Shortly after Boleyn's execution, King Henry VII married his new wife, Queen Jane Seymour, who on the same day, just 11 days later, entered the royal apartments. Not long after, merely a year after the wedding, the king and his third wife Jane had a new son, Prince Edward. This boy was special because he was not just a child, but the future heir to the throne. Such wars for the throne, in which the king himself fought for his life and future dynasty, made him especially cautious and diligent in matters of succession. By the time Elizabeth was only 12 years old, she had already received an exceptional education. She translated into English several prayers written by her adoptive mother, Queen Catherine Parr, as well as into Italian, Latin, and French. She lovingly gifted these translations to her father, demonstrating her high level of education and ability to speak multiple languages. Ultimately, by the end of her studies, it is believed that Elizabeth could be considered one of the most educated women of her time, possessing knowledge and skills well beyond the standard of that era. When she was just a teenager, her father decisively ended his life, leaving Elizabeth an orphan. After the king's death, the responsibility for her was taken up by her new adoptive mother, Catherine Parr. Part 2 of 11. Almost immediately afterwards, Catherine married Thomas Seymour, the uncle of the new king, which brought about new, difficult, and foggy times in the young princess's life. Soon after Elizabeth moved into her new family, 40-year-old Thomas Seymour began to display increasingly alarming and suspicious signs of behavior towards her. His strange actions and deeds were not limited to simple outings. Initially, he started secretly entering her chamber at night, donning a nightgown, and gently tickling the princess. According to many historical records from that time, Elizabeth's guardian, Catherine Parr, did not particularly interfere despite all the signs of improper and inappropriate conduct shown by the new relative. On the contrary, the documents note that she seemingly ignored these warning signs, which undoubtedly raised serious concerns regarding the young princess's safety and well-being. Although she participated in this at least twice, she could not overlook the situations her sister encountered. She assisted her husband in entertaining Elizabeth by playing with her and eliciting genuine smiles from the girl. But one incident became especially troubling and dangerous when she had to hold the princess back to prevent her from leaving, while Seymour was tearing her clothing apart, as if violating acceptable boundaries. This scene was a real shock for her, as she uncovered a terrible truth. Seymour and teenage Elizabeth were embraced in a way that indicated their interactions were rapidly turning romantic, despite the age difference and the circumstances. Whether driven by jealousy or concern for the girl, ultimately, after a quarrel, Seymour was forced to release the princess. However, this was not the end of their conflicts, because just a few months later, after Elizabeth was removed from her environment, Catherine Parr, who had fallen into a difficult situation, died in childbirth, and her body was disposed of as if by chance. Widower Seymour, remaining without a consistent spouse, began to turn his attention once more to the young princess. Growing anxiety and discontent within the royal council regarding Seymour's encroachments on the princess's peace and safety reached a peak. The council believed in his treacherous plans and accused him of treason, as it was revealed that he was contemplating marriage to Elizabeth, which threatened to disrupt the entire system of royal authority. Ultimately, on March 20th, 1549, this tormentor of the princess was executed. Elizabeth, at that time, was barely reaching adolescence, and only on July 20th, 1553, her brother Edward, the only son of Henry VII, died, leaving the kingdom in chaos. This fatal blow was especially hard, as the king's son not only represented the loss of an heir, but also caused unrest among all those living under the throne's shadow. Part 3 of 11. Suddenly, a unique situation arose in the kingdom. As in the absence of a direct heir, the state faced a difficult choice. Shocking news. Edward, by the will of his deceased brother Henry, unexpectedly appointed his cousin Jane Grey as his successor, rejecting the possibility of naming his sister Elizabeth or Mary as heirs. This decision led to a series of dramatic events, as now both sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, found themselves fighting for the right to inherit the throne and establish their claims. Both sisters quickly realized they had a real chance of winning the throne, as their strength and popularity were too great to ignore. Ultimately, Jane Grey was defeated and earned the nickname Queen of 9 Days. Her reign lasted only that short. In August 1553, Queen Mary entered London in a grand procession to formally claim the throne. This moment could have become a symbol of sibling love, demonstrated during the solemn ceremony, but in reality everything was much more complicated. Elizabeth and Mary were often seen as two strong personalities, starkly different from each other, and frequently divided not only by age, but also by views and upbringing, as their mothers, Catherine of Aragon and Henrietta of Bourbon, raised them differently. Mary, born to Catherine of Aragon, was nurtured within strict Catholic traditions and educated in the spirit of religious conservatism, expecting her to adhere strictly to church canons. In contrast, Elizabeth, born during the English Reformation and practically at its peak, grew up amid Protestantism and viewed religion somewhat differently. From a young age, both sisters displayed characteristic traits that made them not only individuals, but also potential rivals. Despite this, they could never become true friends, as their views and upbringing created deep contradictions within them. Mary firmly refused to acknowledge Elizabeth's legitimacy and did not even recognize her as a princess, which was yet another manifestation of their rivalry. Mary evidently had many reasons to cling to her ambitions and fight for the throne, rooted inside her, deeply connected to her unwavering faith and a strict understanding of the role a true queen should fulfill. In this context, their confrontation became not only a political opposition but also a deeply personal one, driven by differences in character and worldview between these two strong women. When it comes to Queen Elizabeth I's life, it's hard not to notice how vivid and contradictory her fate and personal decisions were. To start with, her mother, Mary Tudor, earned the proud nickname Bloody Mary for her brutal repression and ghastly executions of Protestants by burning them alive, methods that inspired fear and dread. Her reign was marked by bloody purges, quickly making her unpopular among the people and the nobility. This is where the nickname Bloody Mary originated, which became firmly established in the memory of future generations. When the uprising broke out in 1554, she immediately suspected her younger sister Elizabeth of being behind it. The authorities could not afford to take risks, and all suspicions led to Mary imprisoning Elizabeth in the Tower of London. The future queen spent 3 terrifying months there, during which her life hung by a thread. During this time, the queen's advisors whispered to her that as long as Elizabeth drew breath, her throne would not be securely protected. They convinced Mary that the only sensible solution was to execute her sister to eliminate a potential threat. However, eventually, Elizabeth's supporters at the court's high levels persuaded Mary to show mercy and keep her sister alive. As a result, Elizabeth was sent into exile in the distant provinces and then placed under house arrest. Time passed, and in 1558, after the death of Mary Tudor, who had long been ill and childless, a new queen ascended the throne, Elizabeth II. Protected and fully aware of the fragility of her power, she spent her reign expecting someone to attempt to marry her. A series of suitors was proposed, as marriage, in the opinion of her advisors, could not only strengthen England's position, but also help maintain internal stability. However, despite all efforts, Elizabeth never married before she turned 50. It might seem that the Queen remained lonely on the throne, but her personal life became a topic of numerous conversations and rumors. Especially notable were her romantic encounters with her young and handsome childhood friend, Robert Dudley. The most interesting thing was that it was not just friendly trust. Dates and connections took place that sparked a whole series of rumors and gossip, as Robert was already married to a woman named Amy Robart, who was dying of breast cancer. Public opinion was firmly convinced that his wife's death was imminent. However, the tragedy that befell Amy proved to be far more mysterious and sinister than expected. Amy died in September 1560, but the cause of her death raised many questions. The official version said she died of breast cancer, but others believed that her death was much more mysterious and cruel. She had fallen from a staircase. The coroner's doctor who conducted the autopsy perhaps concluded that it was an accident, but rumors circulated in the palace that Amy's death might not have been an accident at all, but something far darker and more sinister, a story that remained a secret to many and continues to spark debate among historians and enthusiasts of English royal history. When discussing Elizabeth II, one cannot help but start with how her personal life and political decisions intertwined into a complex web of fateful events. Her determination to marry seemed quite obvious. The Queen's heart was ready to unite with her chosen partner. However, despite her obvious interest, the path to the crown remained closed to her. Historians agree that Elizabeth, although fully prepared for the marriage with Rudolph Dudley, her close friend and ally, had a clear political reason to refuse. At that time, complex dynastic and alliance games were unfolding on the European stage. Royal courts from across the continent sought to win her hand. Advisors counseled their royal clients that marrying Dudley would provoke widespread distrust and even armed rebellion. Ultimately, the Queen, with deep sadness, withdrew from the idea of tying herself in marriage, at least for the time being. But it should not be thought that this meant she had ceased to harbor feelings for Dudley. On the contrary, she continued to remember him, and her jealousy over his time and attention remained very intense. When, eventually, news of his betrayal became known, Elizabeth could not contain her rage. In 1578, Dudley married one of the Queen's distant relatives, Letty Knox. He tried to keep his wedding discreet, fearing to give rise to rumors. But as soon as the news of his marriage reached the Queen, her anger reached its peak. In her fury, she expelled Letty from her court, so deeply outraged that none of her emotions was weaker. Moreover, Elizabeth never forgave the woman who had caused her disappointment, and she rejected any recognition of such an important event in her life. Time went on, and her unwavering refusal to marry, along with her unofficial nickname, the Virgin Queen, rose higher and elevated her figure to a near cult status. Poets who praised her compared her to goddesses and the Virgin Mary, creating a romantic and exalted image of her. Alongside these titles, she bore others such as Gloriana and the Good Queen Bess. But behind these bright labels concealed a completely different, much more complex personality, far from perfection. As Elizabeth displayed her best qualities, she often had to rely on heavy and sometimes poisonous cosmetics. Her makeup consisted of substances containing lead and vinegar, ingredients that caused considerable harm to her skin and health. The high status of the Queen required her to constantly conceal her flaws, leading her to resort to so-called borderline beauty, risking her health to look impeccable. Another characteristic trait was her passionate love of sweets and a strong fear of dentists. As she grew older, the queen faced the problem of yellowed, decayed, and poorly fitting teeth that cracked and fell out. This deterioration of dental hygiene became so noticeable that foreign diplomats often found it difficult to understand her speech. Her voice and pronunciation suffered due to the wear of her mouth. However, it was this frankly careless dental care that became an unexpected fashion trend. Since sugar was an expensive and rare delicacy, many women of that era preferred to blacken their teeth, mimicking the queen, thereby creating a distinctive style that symbolized their social status and belonging to the upper class. Some historians believe that this remarkable woman, who became a symbol of power and wealth for her subjects, could have been not only an outstanding ruler, but also possessed rich linguistic abilities. It is said that Elizabeth I had an incredible talent for learning foreign languages and was able to speak fluently in a total of 11, including Latin, Greek, and even Aramaic. Moreover, she spoke many of them as easily as if they were her native tongues, which testified to her exceptional intellectual capabilities and natural gift for languages. One of the most mysterious and complex aspects of her fate was her struggle with a relative who was also her closest rival for power, her Catholic cousin, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland. This woman initially posed a threat to Elizabeth's reign and her Protestant faith, becoming an embodiment of the ongoing power struggle. This confrontation over many years was tinged with a certain dramatic flair, reminiscent of an ancient saga of power and enmity. At first, despite their mutual hostility, the two relatives engaged in intricate diplomatic games. Elizabeth, despite supporting Scottish rebels opposed to Mary, delicately allowed her archenemy the opportunity to marry her favorite, Robert Dudley. However, this plan never came to fruition. Neither Mary nor Dudley showed genuine interest in each other, and her cunning tactics did not succeed. Over time, the situation grew increasingly severe. Mary's rising power, her unpredictability, and her increasingly extreme decisions forced Elizabeth to take drastic measures. As a result, Mary was imprisoned. She was separated from her newborn son, placed under confinement, and sent to Loch Leven Castle. There, under constant guard, she was isolated for many years, a full 19, until fate condemned her to a new, tragic end. The most astonishing and inhumane moment was the final decision, the execution of Mary Stuart. It is reliably known that once, after uncovering secret circumstances behind her captivity, Elizabeth learned that her cousin was allegedly aiding and inciting uprisings against the English throne. On the same day, February 8, 1567, Mary was beheaded. Her tragic and brutal chapter ended on the scaffold. After this event, Elizabeth experienced a sharp sense of remorse. Justifying herself, she claimed that she signed the death warrant without proper understanding and without the knowledge of her advisors, who immediately executed her order. Many historians consider her explanations sincere. However, most believe that such confessions of remorse are merely a cover for political necessity. After all, it is well known that signing a death sentence for someone without complete certainty and comprehension is almost impossible. Elizabeth Usher's reign entered history as an era of golden times and great geographical discoveries. Among her most famous explorers was the Englishman Sir Francis Drake, who in 1582 undertook a circumnavigation of the globe, culminating in his solemn knighthood. It was thanks to such brave sailors and their achievements that the Elizabethan era is regarded as a time of prosperity, an age when the world's boundaries expanded, and the Queen's name was forever inscribed in the annals of great discoveries and adventures. Armed with fierce determination to defend her lands, England faced the Spanish Armada, one of the most formidable naval fleets in the country, which had been previously dismissed with some disdain as a little shipbuilding coast. This confrontation became one of the most significant moments in history, for it was after this epic showdown that England's naval power, which was almost mythologized worldwide, first firmly established itself as a real factor in global affairs. It all began when Lieutenant Sir Francis Drake's raids against Spanish ships brought English naval strength onto the map, a small but symbolic spark that ignited new hope in people's hearts. The Spanish king, Philip II, desperately resolved to cast aside ongoing worries and to punish England for its audacity, sailing over 100 ships in 1588 to destroy Elizabeth and her authority. At a time when the Byzantine might of Spain was supposed to crush resistance, the British fleet unexpectedly defeated the Spanish Armada. Spanish ships were completely unprepared for the swift assaults from English decks, and Spain's command was forced to retreat hastily, leaving the fleet in ruins and chaos. This defeat dealt a severe blow to Spain's imperial ambitions and was simultaneously a major victory for England. Seizing the crisis caused by the clash with Spain, Elizabeth decided to present herself as a warrior and protector of her realm. During her inspection of the troops, she appeared in a white dress, emphasizing her femininity. Beneath her clothing shone a silver breastplate, a symbol of her fighting spirit. Her famous speech, passed down through the centuries, became one of the most vivid examples of her leadership. "I know I have a fragile and weak body," she said, "but in my heart, I am a king, and in my soul, I am the Queen of England." This speech impressed her contemporaries and has been remembered as a demonstration of courage and determination. People perceive the victory over the Spanish Armada more as a symbol of her personal triumphant will than an absolute strategic success. In reality, it was more of a propaganda achievement, supported by Spanish mistakes rather than an undeniable British strength. The following year, England sent a fleet of 150 ships to Spain, where it suffered defeat. Up to 15,000 people died, and the country lost some of its naval positions, while still maintaining dominance at sea. Many historians believe that it was precisely due to her cautious policy that Queen Elizabeth preferred to remain unattached. Thus, she could retain power without giving it to any of the pretenders, playing with their feelings and interests. However, she also had serious romances, for example with Francis, the Duke of Anjou, who gave her a fashionable earring depicting a frog, a sign of his recognition and love. Elizabeth ruled during an era commonly considered a golden age, a time of cultural flourishing and political stability. Her reign was marked not only by military glory, but also by a literary renaissance. Masterpieces left by figures such as William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe, a period when words and arts reached unprecedented levels of development. However, it is important to remember that, even in an age of triumph and firm authority, the Queen herself carefully chose her allies and kept control over power, which often led to diplomatic intrigues and complex personal relationships. A benefactor of the arts and one of the greatest English poets of her time, Edward Spenser, paid homage to Elizabeth the Fair in his epic work, The Faerie Queen. In this poem, the Queen appears in the image of Belph, a strong, pure maiden hunter fighting against those who try to harm her. Likely, this image, filled with strength and purity, resonated with Elizabeth herself, as Spenser was one of the few writers to whom she made generous donations. Elizabeth lived in poverty after her mother's execution. Her father, Henry VII, completely ignored and neglected his daughter, which prompted her guardian to appeal to the king for funds to provide Elizabeth with decent clothing. Later, as queen, Elizabeth assembled over 2,000 dresses. Yet even that was not enough for her. It was said that once, out of envy, she stole a dress from one of her ladies-in-waiting upon noticing how well it suited her. It is not surprising that the monarch adored fashion and style. Her wardrobe became a source of new fashion trends. Elizabeth constantly refined and updated her outfits, paying particular attention to the choice of images that were meant to convey certain ideas. Most often, she aimed to emphasize her purity and divinity, using clothing as a means of symbolic expression of her qualities and status. At the same time, she generously shared her belongings with court ladies, passing down previously worn dresses. At the same time, the Queen demanded complete devotion and was quite quick to anger. Once, angered by one of her ladies, she broke her finger with a hairbrush and even declared that it was an unfortunate accident caused by a fallen candlestick. Sometimes Elizabeth entrusted her ladies to serve her as true guards, almost as prison wardens. One of her closest and most influential attendants was Bess Hardwicke, who was considered perhaps the most powerful lady at court. In 1569, the Queen herself asked Hardwicke and her husband to oversee the custody of Mary Stuart, the Scottish Queen, a service that lasted 15 endless years, while Elizabeth remained on the throne. Over time, as she grew older, Elizabeth never showed signs of her beauty fading. She continued to praise herself as if she had remained young all these years, the same as on her coronation day, when she was only 25. Unfortunately, it seems that over time, the years took their toll. And, note, the original text ends abruptly here, and I have left the thought incomplete, preserving the tone and stylistic integrity. Elizabeth began to believe them and show preferences only to those who could utter at least a few flattering words in her favor. This approach had very serious consequences. One of her favorites in her later years, Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, exploited his attractiveness too well and quickly rose at court, gaining immense power with minimal responsibility. In 1601, he once again left an important military position without permission, and the Queen finally decided to put him in his place. She placed him under house arrest and deprived him of the luxuries he was accustomed to. In 1601, Essex plotted to kidnap the Queen herself and seize power. However, he underestimated the flaws that prevented him from gathering broad support. Most courtiers and nobles did not like him, and he had almost no supporters. Elizabeth learned of the weak conspiracy, and finally acknowledging her misjudgments, she ordered Essex's execution. This event left an indelible mark on the Queen's soul. She could never recover from the death of her former favorite, and, in essence, suffered from it all her life. In 1602, just over a year after his execution, courtiers devised a theory that her happiness was sitting in darkness and occasionally grieving over Essex with tears. A few years before her death, Elizabeth declared that, being lonely, she was actually married to her kingdom. In her speech, she addressed her subjects with the words, "All my husbands are my good people." The last years of her life passed amidst heartbreak and suffering. In the autumn months of the year 1602, just a few months before her death, many of her close and beloved ones disappeared, and this severely affected her psycho-emotional state. Witnesses of that time report that she spent her last days lying motionless on pillows, immersed in deep philosophical and emotional sorrow, seemingly overwhelmed by incurable melancholy. In the very final period of her life, Elizabeth finally chose her heir, albeit unofficially. It was James VI, the son of her late cousin Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland. Her advisors secretly prepared this prince for the throne by sending him a series of laudatory letters to persuade Elizabeth to make him her successor. Although she did not officially announce her intentions, it is believed that the Queen herself indicated her plans to her advisors as early as March 24, 1603. In the early morning hours of April 21, 1603, Queen Elizabeth II passed away at Queen's Palace. At the time of her death, she was 69 years old. Her reign has forever entered history as one of the most brilliant and complex eras of the English crown. The most famous figure in the history of Great Britain, Queen Elizabeth, left behind extraordinary legacies that continue to surprise even hundreds of years later. As she approached death, she decided to forego the traditional embalming ritual customary for monarchs, which had been long established and considered one of the essential ceremonies. Instead, Elizabeth insisted that her body be preserved in a most natural state and remain untouched by any intervention. Many whispered that this unusual decision was driven by a desire to keep her deepest secrets hidden. However, in any case, her faithful servants and ladies at court carefully guarded her last will, maintaining her final wish even after her passing. When the Queen died, her advisors carefully examined her personal belongings and discovered a very important and touching letter. It was hidden deep inside chests and boxes, and the contents of this message moved them to tears. The letter captured the voice of her longtime beloved, Robert Dudley, who died shortly after the Spanish Armada naval invasion in 1588. The most poignant detail became known thanks to a small remark attached by Elizabeth herself to this letter. She noted it as his last message to me, which imbued all the words with particular emotional warmth and significance in her heart. For a long time, the Tudor dynasty, which began in 1485 under Henry VII and ended with the passing of Elizabeth I, left a significant mark on the country's history. Although the monarch herself preferred to keep her personal feelings and family ties secret for political reasons, she loved her mother and grandmother very much. Fulfilling her duty and respecting the memory of her ancestors, Elizabeth quietly cared for preserving their standing and authority at the court. She always wore a small medallion with her mother's portrait on a chain, which served as a symbol of her memory and love for the woman who played an important role in her life. It is worth noting that my story about British queens and their reigns did not end with this era. After Queen Elizabeth II, who ruled the country for a full 70 years, and Queen Victoria, who reigned for more than 63 years, Elizabeth I is recognized as one of the longest reigning monarchs in history. She led the British state for 44 years, and her rule is considered one of the most vibrant and significant periods in the history of the English crown. Thank you for watching this story. I hope it was interesting and informative for you. Don't forget to leave your feedback and explore our other materials, as many more incredible stories and facts from the past await.